Three, two, one, here we go. RAINMAN'S Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Everybody, it's the Rain Man. I want to give a quick shout out to all of you watching. Thank you very much. I know you're going to find this next episode thought-provoking. I love talking to people like Jim Rickards, and I'm very interested in the subjects we're going to discuss today. And I know you're going to get a lot out of it as well. So go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe by pressing my logo at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Also, if you could watch this video to the end, that helps us with the YouTube algorithm, and that helps me grow Rain Man's Take so that we can continue to bring you great content in the future. So thanks again for being a part of the Rain Man's Take community, and enjoy my conversation with Jim Rickards. So my guest is Jim Rickards. Jim, welcome back. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, Brian. Great to be with you. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So, as most of you know, I've had Jim on in the past. It was probably a couple of years ago, and I always enjoy the opportunity to talk to him. And today is a great opportunity for that. He's got a new book out called Sold Out: How Broken Supply Chains, Surging Inflation, and the Political Instability Will Sink the Global Economy. So, I wanted to have Jim on to talk about that. So, before we get going, just by way of a quick introduction, Jim is a New York Times bestselling author. I believe this book is probably number 8 or 9, I think.
Number 7, seventh book.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Several of those books are some of my favorites: Road to Ruin, Death of Money, Currency Wars. They're great books, and I highly recommend them. And after that, he's also the editor of a financial newsletter called Strategic Intelligence. And he has in the past both advised and consulted for some of the highest levels of our U.S. government, from the Department of Defense to the CIA. So whenever Jim has something to say, I always make sure that I make time to listen to it. So thanks again, Jim. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I actually have done all that consulting, or been directly involved one way or another with the CIA, Pentagon, the White House, the Treasury, and the Fed. The problem is they don't listen. So I do. They're very nice. Always nice people. I get the meetings. I'm in different rooms. Yeah, I do have a lot of interaction, but not necessarily people who want to. It's bureaucracy. It is what it is, but. They don't always take the advice, but I'm always happy to give it. And I'm fortunate I get the opportunity to do so.
Well, I guess you can't bring a horse. You can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And that's unfortunate that they don't take the advice of the experts that they're asking.
Well, I had one meeting in the Pentagon, and I was in a tank, and I was with a guy who was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at the time. He's going on to actually have other roles in the intelligence community. But he was the head of federal finance, and his name was David Dollar, which is an interesting name for a guy who's in charge of the dollar. But so he was sitting one seat away from me, and I was basically saying exactly what I would say on an interview like this, talking about threats to the dollar in countries, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS Plus, and others moving away from the dollar, and that is actually happening very rapidly right now. I forecasted for a long time, but now it's here. But I was describing this, same way I would do for your viewers, Brian. And he said, he took his two hands and slammed them, palm down on the desk. He said, "The dollar is the global reserve currency. It has been the global reserve currency and will always be the global reserve currency." I said, "David, I feel like I'm in Whitehall in 1913 listening to John Bull talk about sterling will always be the global reserve currency." I said, "That's nothing you can take for granted, but hopefully other people are listening." But that's that is what you encounter when you get inside government.
God, that is insane. That is insane. And hopefully we'll have enough time at the end because you do go into it in your book. But what the future of not only our financial system but the global financial system.
Yeah.
But let's go ahead right into sold out about the supply chain issues. So most people like me, earlier in the year, you go to a grocery store and there's no baby formula, or you're driving down the 5 from LA to San Diego and you look out and there's 110 or 111 cargo ships anchored offshore just waiting to get
Right.
into the port of Los Angeles. So intuitively, you're like, okay, there's something's wrong. This is not good. But if you could just kind of lay the foundation of just how complex the current supply chain is, and then so that kind of how it started or where you think it's going based on things like that we see in everyday life.
Sure, I'd be glad to. And I start the book, and actually the introduction, before we even get into chapter 1, a lot of detail about the current supply chain breakdown. I make the point that supply chains have always been around. There's nothing new about supply chains. And I give an example of a wreck, a Bronze Age shipwreck in a place called Uluburun, which is off the southern coast of Turkey, the Mediterranean, off the southern coast of Turkey. It's been reliably dated to around 1200 BC, and it was discovered by a Turkish sponge diver in 1985. But it went through 10 years of underwater archaeology and excavation. And what they found was the best preserved cargo of any Bronze Age ship. And what was in there, for example, they found amber, which comes from the region around the Baltic Sea. They found gold, which at the time came from Sudan, southern Sudan. They found swords, which had been manufactured in what would be present-day Syria, Phoenicia at the time. The vessel itself is made of Lebanese cedar. They found a carving of Queen Nefertiti that was probably headed her way in Alexandria in Egypt, and a lot of foodstuffs, olives and grapes and so forth, that were from present-day Greece, Italy, and Spain. But if you take that cargo, and it was all there, you would say, okay, here the Baltic Sea is up here. You're not that far from the Arctic Circle. Southern Sudan's not that far from the equator. Things from the east, present-day Iran or Persia at the time, and from the west, from Spain. That's an area of 5 million square miles, and it was all on one vessel. So that's an enormous supply chain. This was a vessel that was dropping off and picking up cargoes on its route. But so nothing new about supply chains that were around in the Bronze Age. But so what is new? What is new is supply chain science, the ability to, between increased computing power, artificial intelligence, applied mathematics, combined with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, which basically was the launch of globalization, because, during the Cold War, I grew up during the Cold War, we didn't trade with Russia. I mean, I remember when Pepsi-Cola put a plant in there in the 1970s, you would have thought the Cold War was over because you could get a Pepsi in Moscow. But that was about as far as it went, other than some natural resources. So Berlin Wall comes down, Soviet Union fails. China is now on the rise in the post-Mao era, certainly by the 1980s, certainly, and then definitely in the 1990s. Plus, artificial intelligence and the math and the computing power, all the things I described. So supply chain management became a science. And in fact, you go to a major research university today, you can major in supply chain management. It's an academic major, and a lot of people do. And so that lent itself to improved efficiency. And efficiency was the driver. It's just lower costs, lower costs. Walmart's a perfect example. Walmart is credited with inventing something called cross-docking. Well, what's cross-docking? Well, so a truck pulls up at a warehouse, you unload the goods in the warehouse, then another truck pulls up and you unload it and put it on that truck, and off it goes. Well, Walmart said, why don't we cut out the warehouse? Just take it from truck A to truck B or truck C, heading for its final destination. That's not only faster, but you don't have any inventory, you lower your financing costs. You wonder how they get to everyday low prices. Well, that's one of the ways they do it. I think we're all familiar with just-in-time inventory that was invented by Toyota. That was called the Toyota Management System, or TMS. But many, many examples of that, stretching supply chains longer from Chongqing to New York. I think it's about 9,000 miles. Outsourcing for cheaper labor, reaching out to natural resources, et cetera. But the one thing it had in common was lower the cost to the end user. And that's one of the reasons. There are others, but one of the reasons why there really was not much inflation certainly from 2009 to 2019. But even going back to the 90s, the period of the Great Moderation, this was part of the reason for it. The problem was there was a hidden cost. There was a cost that was not taken into account. And as you were making these, as you were stretching the supply chains longer, making them more complicated, densely connected, and more efficient, you were also making them much more fragile. They were much more prone to breakdown. And I can give you a concrete example of that. So Germany, of course, is a major automobile manufacturer. You got Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, BMW, and other manufacturers. Well, an automobile has about 100 miles of wiring in it, just electronics and connections and all that stuff. Well, you can't just throw the wiring around the seat or on the floor. There are these plastic conduits that they put in the car first, and then they run the wiring through the conduit, so it ends up where it's supposed to. Turns out those plastic conduits are made in Ukraine. Well, Ukraine's got a few problems right now, and they're not making plastic conduits. So all of a sudden, you were shutting down assembly lines in Germany making BMWs and Porsche because you couldn't get a plastic part from Ukraine. So on the one hand, I don't doubt that Ukraine was making them more cheaply than West Germany. But on the other hand, your entire car supply chain shut down, at least for a while, because you couldn't get that one part. Well, you multiply that by many other examples. And that's what happened. We lowered costs in a lot of respects, but we made it more fragile. And when one thing breaks down, the whole supply chain breaks down. It's like any complex dynamic system. It's like Jenga or Legos or whatever. You make the thing too big and upside down, it'll fall down. And that's exactly what happened. So I make that point in chapter one. Chapter one is a lot of anecdotal stuff. If you're from the New York area, Junior's Cheesecake is a very famous brand of cheesecake. Well, cheesecake is 85% cream cheese. Oh, there's a cream cheese shortage. They couldn't get any, so they couldn't make the cheesecake. And there were more serious examples, baby formula that's, disrupted lives and children's health and, parents' well-being, et cetera, when they couldn't get baby formula. Right. So mostly anecdotal, but kind of what happened. Chapter 2 goes into why. Why did the supply chain break down? Why did this happen? What things fell apart and what were the causes of it, et cetera. And then chapter 3, we lean forward and I talk about what I call supply chain 2.0. So the supply chain I described, I call it supply chain 1.0 from 1989 to 2019. Though there will be a supply chain 2.0 going back to my Bronze Age example. There's always a supply chain, but it's going to look very different. So I talk about what's different about it, how costs and investment opportunities will change. Right now, we're in an in-between period. Supply chain 1.0 has crashed. Right. Supply chain 2.0 is coming. We're in an in-between period, very muddled, very uncertain, higher costs, but no quick resolution. So that's kind of the outline of this supply chain part of the book. I have 2 more chapters. There's a part 2, which I call money, and chapter 4 is on inflation, and chapter 5 is on deflation. Now, the inflation, that wasn't gratuitous. A lot of the inflation is being caused by the breakdown in the supply chain. This inflation, energy shortages, not enough truckers, not enough trucks, can't get diesel, can't get fertilizer to raise crops, can't get strategic metals from Russia. Boeing buys almost half their aluminum from Russia. Well, we got a war going on. There's a financial war. You can't get it, et cetera. So talk about all that. And then I make the point that this may tip very quickly into deflation. And investors are not ready for that. Inflation, you can't avoid it. It's in your face. You pull up in your Ford F-150 pickup and it used to be $75 to fill it up. Now it's $150. So you don't have to tell people about inflation. But investors are not ready for disinflation and deflation, which are coming very fast. That's going to turn the investment world upside down. So we talk about that and explain it, reasons why, and again, help investors weather the storm.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I've always liked about not only your books, but hearing you talk is you have the ability to kind of break it down so that something as complex as this, it's you're able to break it down so that people like me can actually kind of follow what you're talking about. Classic example, and 2 questions really. So this was early in the year, the 109 ships off the coast of LA. I guess towards the end of October, they had finally had all kind of gotten through the system, and so there was maybe 3 or 4 that were left. Is it a mistake to think that, okay, things have kind of settled down, or is that just kind of we're in the eye of the hurricane right now, and it just sort of naturally moved everything through?
Well, there's a great question, Brian. When you said October, I assume you meant October 2022. But there was another famous story in October 2021. Let me tell that quickly, and I'll get directly to your point. So in, I believe it was November 2021, the headlines were supply chain breaking down. You can't get this, no candy canes for Christmas, et cetera, et cetera. And Gene Soroka, who's the head of the Port of Los Angeles, good guy, knows his stuff, had a press conference with the Secretary of Commerce, and they went out there and said, there had been, so there's been a 25% reduction, actually more than that, like 40% reduction in the backlog of ships waiting to unload at the Port of Los Angeles. The number had gone from, round numbers, about 90 down to 45 or so. Problem solved, we saved Christmas. That was completely bogus. And here's why. There were, say, 90 vessels, but there's something called the SAMA. It's a secure area around Los Angeles where they count the vessels. Well, once it became clear that you couldn't unload, the captains went down to Baja. They said, I'm not going to pay demurrage and hang out around Los Angeles. So did the number of vessels waiting very close to the port go down? It did. That was valid, but it was only because they went down to Baja, went other areas to wait their turn. In fact, there was a trans-Pacific traffic jam. They're sitting in Yokohama and Ningbo, which is the major port near Shanghai. They said, what's the point of leaving if I can't unload when I get there? And that was true. So you had a trans-Pacific cargo traffic jam, if you want to put it that way. And the press conference was bogus. Now, having said that, you are also correct that by October of this year, that backlog had gone down a lot. The cost of containers, 40 by 20 foot, steel containers that they put on the vessels was so low, they were being abandoned. I mean, Governor Ducey in Arizona used it to build a wall, a border wall with Mexico, which is a very good idea. First of all, it works. And secondly, even if you punch a hole in the container, you're in the container. You still got to get out the other side. So it might actually be better than a wall. So they put them to good use. But everyone says, okay, supply chain problem over. No, the question is why is that true? And again, shipping rates are down, container costs are down, containers are being abandoned, and the logjam at the port has diminished. But why? The answer is we're heading into a recession that there's been demand destruction because of Fed interest rates. So it kind of went like this. This is called the bullwhip effect, but the name kind of describes it all, how a little flick of the wrist can cause a pretty sharp reaction at the end of the bullwhip. Here's what happened. So it's January 2022. You're a purchasing manager for a major importer. You understand the supply chain is falling apart. You're like, you know what? I want 100 cases of this, but I'm going to order 300 cases because maybe only part of it gets through. But if a third of it gets through, I got what I want, and I won't worry about the extra order because it's jammed up in LA. What happened was there was a diminution in the logjam. But all of a sudden, the 300 cases show up. Instead of 100, you got 300 now because you triple ordered at exactly the same time that the Fed was raising interest rates and destroying demand. So now warehouses went from empty to full, but all you've done is create a separate problem. And so now what are they doing? What do you do when you've got excess inventory? What do you do when sales are dropping? You dump the merchandise, you cut prices, you have sales, 2 for 1, 3 for 1, et cetera, which destroys revenues and destroys margins and will take down the stock market. So is it true that the logjam around the Port of LA has been alleviated? Yes. Is it true that the container shortage is gone to the point where there are excess containers? Yes, that's all true, but not for good reasons. It's because the Fed has destroyed demand. We're heading into a recession, and that's going to cause other problems. And by the way, that's one example, and you're quite right about that. But supply chain shortages pop up all over the place. It's not that all the shelves are bare, which you saw in East Germany in 1955. The shelves were literally bare. But it's certain things aren't there. So the paper goods are back, but they're missing the hot sauce. Or I can get diapers now, but there's no canned goods, et cetera, which is another problem. I happen to like a particular brand of hot salsa. I like spicy food. And I'd go to the supermarket and there wouldn't be any. The shelf would be bare. Okay. I go back a second time, the shelf would still be bare. I go back the third time, and they got in a case. I go, okay, there it is. I would normally buy 2 jars, but now I would buy 10 jars. It's what supply chain managers call safety stock. I got 10 jars in my kitchen right behind me here. And there's costs involved. I got to pay for it. So I got inventory costs, But my point being, so I'm a hoarder, but so are a lot of other people. And the person who came in after me didn't get any because I took it all. Or that can happen to me. So all these efficiencies are still bouncing around different parts of the supply chain. And it manifests itself in different ways. And it's still not showing up. A lot of it's not as visible. Like, yeah, cargo vessels are visible. Hot sauce on a shelf is visible. But what about strategic metals from Russia? Titanium, aluminum. What about the inputs for everyone? They want you to buy an electric vehicle. Well, okay. How do you make a battery? Well, you got lithium, you got cobalt, you got nickel, you got copper. I mean, that's a lot of poisonous chemicals in an EV battery. It's not like a little, a plant down there running the thing. So, but the point is that causes environmental destruction. I recently invested privately in a lithium mine in Kazakhstan. I mean, I don't think I don't think the existential climate crisis, whatever it might be, is not caused by humans. CO2 emissions have no impact. It's a trace gas. They don't even know what it does. So it's not like I buy into that. I don't. But I do know that lithium prices have tripled in the past year. And even if it's not feasible in the long run, there's going to be huge demand in the short run. Yeah. So it looks like a good investment. But there are things like that should affect investment decisions and still affect certain parts of the supply chain.
Interesting. And you mentioned it briefly in the book, talking about the Port of Los Angeles and some of the reasons why those ships get kind of backlogged and they're waiting to go through the process of offloading. And this, living here in California and basically disagreeing with everything that the California state government does.
Yep.
I find it hard to believe that they are, LA is one of the top ports in the world.
Sure.
And yet their green policies are such that they don't allow the amount of trucks needed to enter into California because of their emission standards. So how can they be doing both? They can't be doing both.
Well, that's right. I mean, and then they want solar module powered forklifts, electric batteries. One of the greatest things, Brian, for better or worse, I've actually had most of the jobs that I write about. I drove a forklift. I was a taxi driver. I worked on a farm. I picked strawberries, worked in a supermarket. I've had a lot of these everyday jobs, and there's dignity in all work. So I know it's a little something about forklifts. But California said you got to power your forklifts with power from solar modules or windmills. Okay, good luck. It's intermittent power, very unreliable. Good luck running your forklifts with that. And you're right about the trucking regulations. A lot of truckers said, hey, I showed up at the port to get my cargo. Then you get inside and you find out those containers, by the way, you can only stack them 6 high for safety reasons. You can't stack them 13 high. And that was one of the bottlenecks, which was they had because President Biden said, well, work longer hours. It didn't matter. You could work 24 hours or 26 hours a day, but there was no place to put them. There was no place to put the containers. And then the truck pulls in, his container's on the bottom. You know how long it takes to move the top 5 and get to the bottom and put it on the truck, et cetera. So you saw many, many things like that. And those problems have not gone away. And they estimate there's a shortage of about, the last estimate I saw was 80,000 truckers. But that number is going up. And why is that? Well, a lot of them, they had to stay home during COVID. They wanted to drive, but they couldn't cross the Canadian border. I mean, there's an enormous amount of U.S.-Canada trade. You had to be vaccinated. And that was a group that was disproportionately, rightly in my view, resisted the vaccines, which are not vaccines. They're experimental gene modification treatments, but that's a separate, we could talk about that in some other podcast. But if you stay home long enough, you say, well, maybe I'll just retire. Maybe I got enough, or you lose the work habit, et cetera. And you're like, but what about younger people coming in who want to be truckers? And there are a lot of them potentially. Well, they're looking at the headlines, and looking at the internet. And here's Elon Musk with his autopilot truck. So why do you want to train to be a trucker if they're going to be driven by computers in a few years, which they may be? The answer is you don't. You'll pick another career. So you got mid-career people retiring early. people home because of COVID, and younger recruits not coming in because they don't want to be replaced by Elon Musk. And I'm not discussing the pros and cons of that. I'm just saying this is how it is. So that shortage is not going away.
It's mind blowing. All right. Kind of put you on the spot here. You talk about this as well in the book. Who is there a certain administration that's to blame for this? Is it Biden screwing it all up? Did Trump have something to do? I mean, obviously this has been building for a while, but what was kind of who was kind of responsible for the straw that broke the camel's back?
Well, straw that broke the camel's back would have to be Biden, but Trump played a role, and I talk about that in the book. So, you look at the war in Ukraine, that definitely scrambled global supply chains. We can talk about that. Look at the pandemic panic and the bad public policy that came out of it. You can talk about that, and that made it worse. But it didn't start with either one of those things. They both made it worse. The supply chain breakdown started with Trump's tariffs on China in 2018. And he originally slapped them on consumer goods, refrigerators and washing machines and all that. It didn't mention China by name, but it happened to be the case that most of them came from China, and solar modules was the other thing. And again, I don't want to debate trade policy. I actually think that was a good move by Trump. I think it was overdue. But there's no denying the fact that that was the beginning of the supply chain breakdown. And we know that, and this is important, Brian, you can't just make statements. You got to back it up with hard data analysis, or at least anecdotes. And we have the data. Every cargo vessel in the world, oil tanker, dry bulk carrier, container cargo vessel, or otherwise, has a GPS monitor, has a serial number. It's tracked. You can go online and find out where they are. And so we can look at cargo flows and contents and where they went and see the breakdown happening. There happens to be a very good book by a writer, researcher, Lorianne LaRocco, and I mentioned her in my book. And the timing, her timing couldn't be more perfect from my point of view, which is she finished a book on the impact of tariffs on the supply chain in December 2019. So it's like a controlled experiment because it was pre-COVID, pre-Ukraine. Normally, when a bunch of things are happening together, it's very hard to unscramble the data. But here's a pure case where, unaffected by COVID or Ukraine, we could see the breakdown already. And again, let me give you a concrete example. So Trump puts tariffs on China in 2018, a couple of different goods, and that escalated. So what did China do? Well, the U.S. is one of, along with Canada and Brazil, are the three largest producers of soybeans in the world. China is the biggest importer of soybeans in the world because they need the protein and they don't have enough. So, and China was buying all their soybeans from the United States as a way to minimize the trade deficit because we were buying all this stuff from China. So China goes, well, what can we buy from the U.S. just to even things out a little bit? And the answer was soybeans. Well, once Trump throws the tariffs on, China moved their soybean orders to Brazil. They said, we're not buying any more U.S. soybeans. Well, first of all, you can see that in the cargo data that Lorianne reported on, which was a nice piece of research. But think about what that means. This isn't just a question of picking up the phone and changing a purchase order, right? You got to send the vessels in all different directions. You've got to increase port capacity at the new exporting centers. You got to get trucking lanes from the farms to the ports. And the people who do all this, they don't want a 6-month contract. They want a 5-year contract because it's very expensive to implement. So all of a sudden, you're scrambling vessels, you're scrambling trade lanes, you're upsetting port facilities, and you can get through it. And then what did the U.S. farmers do with the soybeans if China's not buying them? Well, they looked around. They said, well, the Netherlands needs them. So we start selling our soybeans to the Netherlands. China's buying their soybeans from Brazil. You're scrambling global supply chains. Now, the irony is everybody's getting about the same amount of soybeans, but we've completely blown up decades of supply chain efficiency, as I described it, to do all this stuff. And the bigger point is we're not going back. China's going to keep going to Brazil because this isn't like a quick fix. So, and the U.S. farmers got a lower price and the Brazilian farmers were happy. They got a higher price. But these are very delicate, complex, densely interconnected systems. And once you blow up one part of it, you're going to have all kinds of repercussions that are going to keep going on. Now, COVID made it worse, of course, and the war in Ukraine has made it much worse. But it really did start in 2018. So it's not really a critique of Trump. It's just the case. Again, I think he got the trade policy right, but boy, were there ramifications. Now, Biden, Biden was much more deliberate, and their policies, Biden administration policies, are so stupid that I actually can't attribute it all to stupidity. That's too easy. A lot of this has got to be by design because nobody's that stupid. So, first thing he does, first day in office, shuts down the Keystone XL pipeline. Yep. Now, okay, here's what people don't understand. The oil is still coming in from Alberta, has been all along. Pipeline is a cheaper, cleaner, better way to do it. But if you blow up, not literally blow up, that was Nord Stream, but if you shut down the Keystone pipeline, which they did, how does the oil get in? Comes in by train, Burlington Northern Railroad. Who bought the Burlington Northern Railroad 5 years ago? Warren Buffett. Okay, so Warren Buffett is the biggest winner. So you line up 100, you can probably tell I come from a railroad family, but you line up 100 tank cars end to end in a train, it's a pipeline on wheels. Yeah. That's what it is. Here it comes.
And probably more potentially dangerous for
dirtier, more dangerous, more expensive, et cetera. There's a lot of bad things about that. Yeah. But so you didn't change the oil flows. You did make it more expensive, dirtier. Well, why would you do that? Well, because some of it's symbolic. But what you have to understand about the Biden crew and Jennifer Granholm, the energy secretary, knows. They want $10 gasoline. They've wanted $10 gasoline for 20 years because they want you to go buy an $80,000 electric vehicle. And if they can make gasoline expensive enough, it makes the electric vehicle relatively more competitive. But wait a second, you're talking about people who can't afford $150 to fill up an F-150 twice a week, but they're supposed to go buy an $80,000 EV. And by the way, what's in the battery only lasts 8 years. Again, don't get me started on electric vehicles. They're not feasible either. But that's the way they think. The problem with ideologues is they're ideologues. The key word in ideologue is an idea. They have an idea in their head. They're resistant to facts. They're resistant to feasibility. They're resistant to the laws of physics. They don't want to hear any logical arguments. They just want to push the idea. John Kerry's running around. He's got that bad wig. Looks like a David Crockett hat I used to wear when I was a kid, but flying around on private planes. But he's supposed to be our guru on clean energy or whatever. But they don't know anything. Or if they do, they're pursuing a hidden agenda as part of the Green New scam, but it's hurting all of us.
Yeah. And obviously, you just touched on a bunch of subjects that I wish we had several hours and a couple of martinis to really go over. But I happen to agree with you completely about that concept of they cannot be this stupid. It's got to be by design. And that's the one thing. And before we kind of get into that, where I'm going with that is, what's going to be happening to not only our monetary system, but the international monetary system starting in 2023 moving forward. But before we get into that, just real quick, because I did find this fascinating in the book, you talk about all the airline delays that we had throughout the year and how you don't think of an airline being flown by human beings and all this sort of thing. You don't think of that necessarily as a supply chain, but it is. And can you just kind of touch on that real quick? Because I found that very, very interesting.
Sure. So beginning late last year, late 2021, there were just enormous airline delays. We all know about this. Thousands of flights canceled day after day. Well, and the airlines say, what was the weather? Well, there's always weather. I mean, not like that, not to account for that number of cancellations. What was going on behind the scenes was the following. The avionics industries, avionics are aviation electronics. So it's the electronic devices that control the plane, GPS, autopilot, and gauges, and a lot else. It's very much centered in Wichita, Kansas, or in that surrounding area. And that's just how industries grow. Why is Raleigh, North Carolina, a biotech center? Why is San Jose, California, Silicon Valley? Because the smart people want to be with other smart people, or if you're an expert, you want to be with other experts. Well, Wichita, just for historic reasons and other reasons, happens to be the center of the avionics industry. This is an industry that is like a lot of, 50-year-old white guys. I mean, let's tell it like it is, right? That demographic was very resistant to the COVID vaccine. I would say for good reason. Well, but they're all federal contractors, or a lot of them, because you may work on civilian aircraft, but you're doing stuff for the Air Force or other branches of the U.S. government. So Biden comes down with this COVID mandate. They could never make it stick for the entire population, even though they wanted to, but they could make it stick for a while to federal contractors and federal employees. So these people were told you had to be vaccinated. They said, no, I'm not doing that. And they, a lot of them left. They started their own smaller companies. They didn't work for federal government. There were shortages. They retired early. So there was a complete breakdown in the ability of the avionics industry to make changes and upgrades and new systems because of the vaccine mandate. But again, Brian, really good example of how, one order over here screws up something else over there because of the dense interconnections. So that was the first thing. Now, the second thing happening is here comes 5G, right? That's, new towers, new frequencies, broadband, greater bandwidth, et cetera. So they're putting up 5Gs near the airports, among other places, 5G towers near the airports. But meanwhile, the air traffic controllers are trying to deal with the pilots and use the avionics. There was interference between the two. And by the way, the altimeters have been around since the 1930s, so not exactly a new concept. Right. And cell phones have been around since the 1980s, or as they started to come in. You would have thought somebody would have figured this out, but it turns out that the 5G frequencies interfered with the avionics. And now there's an upgrade. You can fix that, but you got to go to Wichita and get the people to do the upgrade. And they weren't there because of the vaccine mandate. So you got 5G, avionics, Wichita, COVID mandates, orders from Washington, all interacting in such a way that they could do it. And it got to the point where the Secretary of the Transportation and the head of the Federal Aviation Administration had to sign a joint, and the FCC had to sign a joint letter ordering Verizon and AT&T to delay the implementation of 5G because it would interfere with the avionics. So that's sorry to be so long-winded, but that was the backstory on why there were so many flight delays. Now, again, it's like the Port of Los Angeles, little by little, they're remedying that with the passage of time, but new problems pop up. So it's really breaking down all over the place, but it's kind of sequential. Is here, then another industry, and you're going to see it in aircraft manufacturing and other sectors. And we haven't even spoken about the war in Ukraine. I'm privileged to honored to teach a course in financial warfare at the U.S. Army War College, and it's in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The Army is the host, but it's inter service. So my class, it's about 12 or 13 handpicked officers, lieutenant colonels. I had a Navy commander. We had I once had the Top Gun, the fighter pilot who actually was the Top Gun that year. He was in my class. And these are people who are handpicked. It's called the Advanced Strategic Arts Program. And they're kind of designated as the future 3-star generals, national security advisors, the big brains of the future. And I teach the module on financial warfare. And I taught this class, last time I did it was last April 2022, right after the war in Ukraine began. But for 10 years or 15 years before that, I had done intelligence work, not exclusively, but often involving sanctions, because you don't just slap sanctions on, you need intelligence collections to figure out who the bad guys are. So I just knew a lot about that. And I stood up, I said, I'll tell you right now, these sanctions are not going to work. Yeah. And it's worse than that. They're going to boomerang. They're not going to hurt Russia, and they are going to hurt us. And, in fairness, there was a lot of skepticism in the class, and that's okay. I teach it seminar style. I like the pushback, but I said, check it out. So the Russian ruble today is stronger than it was before the war. Remember, we're going to crush the ruble. We're going to cut them off, kick them off of SWIFT, and freeze their account. The Russian ruble is so strong that Elvira Nabiullina, who's the head of the Central Bank of Russia, had to cut interest rates because she was worried that the ruble was too strong. They're making $21 billion a month. Their oil and natural gas revenues are up. What they couldn't sell to Germany, they sold to China. Yeah, there were some costs. There were some frictions involved, but Russia's trade surplus is up. Their inflation has come down. Their interest rates are coming down. The ruble's stronger. They're doing fine. Who's suffering? West Germany is Paleolithic. I mean, the West Germans are going out into the woods, chopping down trees for firewood to keep warm this winter. You can't buy firewood in West Germany. You can't buy it. You got to go chop down a tree. Poles are lined up in their cars at coal depots to get a trunk full, or if you have a pickup truck, a flatbed full of coal so they can stay warm. And the lines are 3-4 days long. They're sleeping in their cars to get cold. The Germans are chopping down trees. I mean, these are Germany's was the fourth, actually might be the third largest economy in the world today. I think they just passed Japan. And very high tech, high value added,
Right.
precision manufacturing, everything you want, watches, cars, machines, Siemens. Think of the BASF. Think of the companies, Volkswagen in Germany, and they're shutting down because of energy shortages. And it's going to get really bad this winter. They're going to ration the fuel. Thermostats are going to be at 50 degrees Fahrenheit and the centigrade equivalent. I don't know, I think it's like 15 or something. But they better have some Everest rated sleeping bags to stay warm in their own houses. Well, it's not just that. I mean, it is that, but that's going to lead to social unrest. You're going to have a government turnover. You're going to have riots. Sad to say, and you can see all this coming. So.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's how wars all start.
Right.
Okay, it's going to be very interesting to see what goes on in Western Europe this winter. Real quick, the book is sold out. Jim Rickards, best-selling author, and it's available now. Take a look at it. I highly recommend it. And then after that, any of the other books that Jim's written, it is great knowledge base to kind of understand what's going on in the world. And that brings me to my final question, and that is, you wrote book Currency Wars, Death of Money. Things are changing in not only the U.S. kind of monetary system, but the world is changing rapidly with all the talk about digital currencies. Gold is starting to get a little bit more popular in terms of people talking about it. What do you see happening moving forward with the sort of geo-economic scene?
Sure. The dollar is vulnerable, but let me kind of break that into two parts because people often don't make the distinction. There's the role of a currency as a reserve currency. Reserves are just, if you make a certain amount of money and you spend a certain amount of money, you got some left over, that's your savings account. That's what reserves are. It just means the country ran a trade surplus or had a capital inflows, and they have reserves. Then there's a payment currency. If I buy something from you, how do I pay for it? And there, it's a very different analysis. When I was a kid, we could use, baseball cards or bottle caps, right? So almost anything can be a payment currency as long as two or more parties are willing to accept it. So you need to separate the two. So the role of the dollar as reserve currency, first of all, it's not reserve currency. It's the currency denomination of the assets in the reserves, meaning the People's Bank of China does not have pallets of $100 bills stacked up in the basement. What they have are U.S. Treasury securities that are denominated in dollars. So you don't actually have dollars as your reserves. You have securities as your reserves, but they're in dollars. But that's an important distinction because it's very hard to dethrone a currency as a reserve currency because the question you have to ask is not, do I like the currency or not, but is there a securities market big enough to absorb my savings? And that's where the dollar has the edge because the Treasury market is by far the biggest, most liquid, rule of law backed securities market in the world, and the only one big enough to absorb those inflows. Now, the euro has a substantial reserve position. U.S. dollar denominated security is about 59%, call it 60 for a round number. Europe's euro is about not quite 30. So together, they're between 85 and 90%. And all the other currencies, sterling, Japanese yen, Swiss francs, Chinese yuan, which is tiny, they're all squished into that 10% slice. But it's mostly dollars and euros. But even for euros, they don't have a unified government bond market. There's no such thing as a euro bond, meaning full faith and credit of the entire European monetary system. You can buy German bonds, you can buy Italian bonds, you can buy Spanish bonds. They're in euros, but there's no such thing as a European Monetary Union or European Union bond. So even that's not big enough to absorb it. And forget China. See, you need to have a bond market that can serve as a reserve asset. First of all, you need a lot of them. You need all maturities from 30 days to 30 years. You need primary dealers or underwriters to distribute your bond issues. You need custody, settlement, clearance, futures, options, when issued trading, And above all, in addition to all that infrastructure, you need the rule of law. And China doesn't have any of that. They have a lot of debt, but they don't have a mature bond market, and they don't have all the other things I mentioned. Neither does Russia, and they won't have it for 10, 20 years, even if they start it today. So the dollar as a reserve currency has a very solid position, very hard to change. As a payment currency, that's completely different, because that's just what we're going to settle with. And there's a lot of activity. The BRICS, it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have now rebranded themselves BRICS Plus. And when they have a BRICS conference, they invite Argentina, Iran, Turkey, Mexico, a lot of other people show up. And they are working on, now they said, this is all public, they said a commodity-backed currency that we can share and use as a means of payment between each other, among the group, in place of the dollar. Yeah. Now they're working on that, right? But they're very quickly going to encounter the same problem John Maynard Keynes encountered at Bretton Woods in 1944, which is, commodities are not quite as generic as people think. So oil, right? There's 72 kinds of oil around the world based on viscosity, sulfur content, transportation costs, etc. It seems generic. It trades like a commodity, but it's a little more complicated than that. Same thing with wheat. Same thing with every other commodity you can think of. There's one and only one commodity that's just, it is what it is. You don't have to worry about viscosity or sulfur. It's gold. Gold is an element, atomic number 79. It's either gold or it's not gold. But you don't have to worry about sulfur content, right? So Keynes arrived at a gold-backed global currency called the Bancor at Bretton Woods, and I've read the papers. He actually published academic papers on it. Not because he was a gold bug, he wasn't, but because he recognized that why have all these funky variable commodities? What are we wasting time for? Let's just go to gold. So I think that's where BRICS Plus will end up. Not quite there yet. But we always have to relearn the same old lessons. They should just read Keynes's papers. There's another group called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's Russia, China, and a handful of Central Asian republics. They are also expanding their membership. So they have like a waiting list of, probationary members or members applying. So they're expanding as well. They're working on the same thing. China is talking to Saudi Arabia about would they accept yuan for oil, Chinese yuan and payment for oil. Yeah, Chairman Xi is going to Riyadh. That's a very big deal. He doesn't leave the country much, but he's going to Riyadh to talk to MBS and King Salman about that, and many other similar initiatives around the world. So there's a lot of ferment there. Could you have I'm not talking about cryptocurrency, but could you have a digital currency shared among the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, used for payments, keep score, have a surplus or a deficit, and then settle up 4 times a year in gold? Yeah. That might be where we end up. And with that currency I described pegged to gold, and once you use gold for net settlement, you don't need nearly as much gold. If you're paying for everything gross, that's a lot of gold. But if it's net and periodic, it's far less gold, and yet it's gold backed. So it's going to take a while. But here's where it all comes together, Brian. The movement to dethrone the dollar, get away from the dollar as a payment currency, is very far along. It's making very good progress. Partly because, and I told the Treasury this, I told the Pentagon, I told anyone who would listen, I said, sanctions can be powerful, but if you overuse them, you're going to get a reaction function that's going to undermine them completely. In other words, if I'm using the dollar as a baseball bat to bash all these other countries, how long before they just get out of the way or get their own baseball bat? And that's what's happening, is because China's sitting there saying, you actually froze the assets of the Central Bank of Russia, a major central bank, 12th largest economy in the world, because you didn't like what they did in Ukraine. Okay, Ukraine's a separate subject. But China said, what if you don't like something I do and you freeze my dollars 2 years from now? Maybe I better get out while the getting's good. Saudi Arabia is saying the same thing. Turkey's saying the same thing. So that movement. But at what point, so here's where it all comes together. At what point does the movement to a new payment currency lead to a new reserve currency? Because you say, well, okay, now that we got the currency, why don't we have a bond market? Yeah. So I've always said no country or group of countries could destroy the dollar, but we could do it ourselves. And that's what's happening.
All right. On that pleasant note, so it is, the book is sold out again, Jim Rickards, and Check him out on Twitter. He's very active on Twitter. If you want kind of day-to-day play-by-play of things that are actually happening in real time, it's great to follow Jim there. And then if you want to go even further into his knowledge base, is that financial newsletter, Strategic Intelligence. So highly recommend all of those things. Jim is great, and it's always a pleasure to have you on. So thank you very much, Jim, for joining me today.
Thanks, Brian.
All right. Hey, I'll finish off like I always do. If you're in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. And Jim Rickards, thanks again.
Thanks.
All right. This is the Rain Man. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.